From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Our top story tonight is on Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis. Unicef says an estimated 1 million Afghan children could die of malnutrition. In a statement, UNICEF Executive Director Henrietta Fore said around 10 million children across Afghanistan need humanitarian assistance to survive. She said she anticipates that the needs of the children and women will increase over the coming months amidst severe drought and the ongoing pandemic. Fore added that an estimated 4.2 million children in Afghanistan are out of school. Many Afghans who fear retribution are scrambling to flee the country. However, the Taliban has assured the security of foreign missions, international aid organizations, and agencies. We will have an in-depth analysis on this later on the show, so stay tuned. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC, on Sunday called on member states, Islamic financial institutes, and partners to swiftly provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. It also said the country should never again be allowed to shelter terrorist organizations. The OIC called for inclusive dialogue to resolve the crisis following the Taliban's takeover of the country. The Jeddah, Saudi Arabia-based organization said it would dispatch envoys to Afghanistan to stress the importance of peace, stability, and national reconciliation.
كما ننتظر حماية واحترام الحق في الحياة والأمن وكرامة أبناء الشعب الأفغاني وفقا للصكوك الدولية لحقوق الإنسان.
The Taliban has warned the United States must leave Afghanistan by August 31st or face a reaction. U.S. President Joe Biden said Sunday he was still planning to finalize the evacuation from the country by that date.
There's discussions going on among us and the military about extending. Our hope is we will not have to extend, but there are going to be discussions, I suspect, on how far along we are in the process.
However, he left the door open to extend the deadline if necessary. 33 U.S. Air Force planes are heading to Kabul International Airport in the next 24 hours. This is in addition to 18 aircrafts provided by American Airlines, Atlas Air, Delta Airlines, Omni Air, Hawaiian Airlines, and United. CNN is reporting that the Taliban is helping the U.S. sort through people eligible according to the U.S. criteria. On Sunday, Taliban security pushed back crowds at the airport a day after 7 Afghans were killed in a crush at the gates. Taliban spokesman Suhail Shaheen told the UK's Sky News that if the U.S. extends the deadline, it will mean that they're extending occupation of the country. This, he said, will create mistrust between the Taliban and the U.S. Shaheen added if the U.S. is intent on continuing the occupation, it will provoke a reaction. Taliban has earlier accused the U.S. of violating the February agreement signed by the U.S. and Taliban, which has called for withdrawal by May. Shaheen also insisted that many of the people seeking to flee the country were economic migrants and not really in fear for their lives. Around 17,000 people have been evacuated by the U.S. since August 14th. Meanwhile, safe in the Ukraine, Sahra Karimi, head of the official Afghan film organization, is criticizing American soldiers. She says they're treating people violently at the airport, where hundreds are seeking to escape Afghanistan. Karimi says the American army's behavior is very bad with Afghans, even women and children. She said American soldiers are beating people, threatening them with grenades, and shouting at them. The 7-day average COVID deaths in the U.S. has passed 1,000 for the first time since March. Hospitalization rates for children and adults are soaring. The U.S. could see 200,000 COVID cases a day again. The country is already at 145,000 cases a day. Hospitals and ICU beds continue to fill up in Florida as COVID-19 cases continue to rise. Close to 17,000 people are currently hospitalized with COVID-19 across the state. The surge in cases has pushed some Alabama hospitals to the brink. The state's healthcare leaders are using the crisis as an opportunity to urge vaccination and school mask mandates. In related news, conservative radio host Phil Valentine, who mocked vaccination for COVID and later regretted his earlier stance, died of COVID last Saturday in Nashville. Also on Saturday, former President Donald Trump was booed at an Alabama rally after encouraging his supporters to get vaccinated. New Zealand on Monday again extended its nationwide COVID-19 lockdown until August 27th. Speaking to reporters, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said that the cabinet has decided New Zealand will remain on level 4 lockdown for another 4 days. The country confirmed its first case of COVID's Delta variant in a traveler who arrived from the Australian state of New South Wales last week. Last Tuesday, New Zealand authorities put the entire country on level 4 lockdown. This was after the first locally transmitted COVID-19 case was reported in the community since February. Environmentalist group Extinction Rebellion has launched a series of protests over 2 weeks in central London. Thousands of demonstrators are demanding government action on global warming and climate issues. Thousands of people filled Trafalgar Square on Monday to participate. Extinction Rebellion announced their plans to disrupt the City of London for contributing 15% to global carbon emissions. At least 9 people were arrested on Sunday night. Climate activists climbed the facade of Guildhall, the City of London's government headquarters. At least 22 people were confirmed dead due to floods on Sunday in Tennessee. Rescue crews continue to search desperately for 45 people still missing amidst shattered homes. The record-breaking rain sent floodwaters surging through parts of Tennessee. A flash flood warning was in effect for several Middle Tennessee counties with 2 days advance notice. An 8 p.m. curfew is in effect in flood-affected areas as helicopters and aid teams sent to the region continue their search and rescue efforts. Egypt closed the Rafah border crossing to occupied Gaza on Monday. A Hamas government spokesperson confirmed the news to AFP. The Egyptian government did not provide any reason for the action. The Rafah border is the only border point with Gaza not controlled by Israel. It was opened in May to allow wounded Gazans to be treated in Egyptian hospitals and to deliver aid. Egypt has brokered the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which ended the hostilities. In the meantime, Israeli occupation forces today bulldozed a vast tract of land in Qalqilia in order to expand a road being built for illegal Israeli settlers. In related news, Israeli settlers this morning set fire to an olive grove in Burin town south of Nablus in the occupied West Bank, the Palestinian Information Center reported. Malaysia's new Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob called on his colleagues to end a months-long political crisis to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. It was his first speech as the country's 4th premier since independence. Malaysia has been enveloped in a political crisis for months amidst growing public anger over the government's handling of COVID pandemic. Thousands have lost their jobs as businesses nationwide have been forced to close due to a series of lockdowns put in place to halt the spread of the virus. Malaysia's healthcare infrastructure is now overwhelmed as it records an average of 20,000 new infections and hundreds of deaths every day. Ismail succeeded Mohyiddin Yassin, who resigned after a turbulent 17 months in office on Monday following the collapse of his razor-thin majority in parliament. A deputy premier in the previous cabinet and a senior official in the ruling United Malays National Organization Party, Ismail was then picked by a majority of MPs to be their leader. Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Saturday said Dr. Afia Siddiqui suffered minor injuries and burns after being assaulted by a fellow inmate at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas last month. Her lawyer, Marwa El-Biali, shared that during her last visit with Dr. Siddiqui, she was shocked to see visible burns around her eyes, an approximately 3-inch scar near her left eye, a wound on her right cheek covered in toothpaste and a small piece of paper, and bruises on her right arm and legs. Her legal team wants reassurance that Dr. Siddiqui is not punished for being a victim of a vicious assault and is safe from future attacks. Dr. Siddiqui is an MIT grad of Pakistani origin who received her PhD from Brandeis University in cognitive neuroscience. She was convicted in 2010 by a U.S. court on charges of trying to shoot a U.S. Army and FBI officers while in custody in Afghanistan. Advocates call the trial of the first victim of the war on terror a sham. She was sentenced to 86 years of imprisonment. Siddiqui says that she was trying to escape in the incident and denies grabbing the weapon or having any familiarities with firearms. She was missing from Karachi for 5 years before she was discovered in Afghanistan. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. To further discuss the humanitarian crisis and refugee situation in Afghanistan, we have with us Ben Osler-Hampson. He's the president of the World Refugee and Migration Council. He's also the Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University and has been a distinguished fellow and director of global security research at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hampson, for being here.
My pleasure.
So, can you tell us overall what the humanitarian situation is like in Afghanistan currently? I'd like you to address what the situation was in early July and how it has changed now with the Taliban takeover.
Well, there are two things that are going on. First of all, I think we have to recognize that there is an ongoing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan because there's a major famine that is underway. There's been a major drought, and so there are significant food shortages, both in rural and urban areas. At the same time, with the Taliban's takeover of the country, there has been a major flight of literally hundreds of thousands of Afghans who've been displaced inside the country, who have moved to seek refuge in cities, in parts of the country where Taliban control is perhaps not as strong as it is in others. At the same time, in the capital, Kabul, there's a humanitarian tragedy unfolding just outside the airport there, where there are literally thousands who are trying to flee the Taliban to get flights out of the country. And we're also obviously hearing about food shortages, shortages of blankets, accommodation for the many thousands who are in Kabul itself.
The ongoing fighting had already displaced several hundreds and thousands of civilians. Can you expand on the presence of IEDs, which are improvised explosive devices, on major roads?
Well, what we're hearing is that some of the fighting is continuing, and there have been certainly the Taliban when they were trying to take over the country, which they've obviously succeeded in doing. They were putting IEDs on roads, attacking civilian transport, setting off bombs in markets, in major areas of congestion. And that has obviously led to many wounded civilians, others who've been injured by their tactics.
And obviously, the world is still in the middle of a pandemic. How has the pandemic affected the situation?
Well, it's made everything a lot worse. There've literally been stories of babies, small children dying in the arms of their mothers who've gotten COVID. The latest variant, the so-called Delta variant of COVID, is running rampant throughout South Asia, I should say, many other parts of the world, obviously including Afghanistan. And when you have people who are living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, who don't have proper access to water, to food, to medicine, the problem is rendered much more acute. What we're also seeing with the Delta variant of the virus is that it is affecting, as I just mentioned, young children. It's leading to higher mortality rates among the young. Some of the earlier variants of COVID did not affect young people to the same degree. They affected older people. But as the virus has mutated, it is now attacking the young. And of course, in Afghanistan, in neighboring countries, where there are many Afghan refugees, they have no access to vaccine. So this is a highly vulnerable population at great risk. People are also getting sick, and that really compounds, the humanitarian dimensions of this unfolding tragedy, which I'm, afraid to say is only going to get worse.
We hear that there are only about 300 ventilators in the entire country. What is the state of the rest of the healthcare system, hospitals? Could you share with us? I know some of them were bombed during the fighting, but are there hospitals that are currently working in different parts of Afghanistan?
Well, there certainly some of the hospitals, some of the major urban centers are still operational. As you mentioned, when it comes to COVID, there's a shortage of ventilators, shortage of oxygen. As a result of the fighting, the fact that the Americans have pulled out, that humanitarian aid, many of those aid flights aren't able to get into the country because of the security situation. The fact that certainly in Kabul, the main international airport there, it's filled with evacuation flights, so it's almost impossible to bring in medical aid and other kinds of assistance that's required to deal with the health needs of the local population. And so, shortage of medicine in the hospitals, the fact that you have a very uncertain security situation. I think it's fair to say that many of the women who've been trained to be doctors in the country are, worried about their own security, safety with Taliban control in the country. So, they're not able to show up for work. That's also true of other kinds of, healthcare assistance. So it's a pretty dire situation, and when it comes to the hospitals, they're also dealing with those who've been injured or wounded in the fighting. and they're not in a position to be able to take the extraordinary demands that are being placed on them.
So what are the options for people? Currently, Iran and Pakistan host millions of refugees. The borders have been opened again for them to cross over. But Afghan refugees are often treated very poorly, especially as they're trying to make their way into Europe. And once they get into Europe, recently we did a report on how they're treated on the streets of Paris. So, what are the options for Afghans currently?
Well, the reports that we've been getting, and we've spoken to some people who are in some of those refugee camps on the border of Iran and Pakistan, and I think it's fair to say that both Iran and Pakistan are trying to control the inflow of refugees. They're not pursuing what we would call an open border policy. It's also fair to say that some of the other neighboring countries, Turkey, don't want to take more Afghan refugees. And I think what it really points to is, and to be honest, they don't have the resources and capacity to be able to feed and house those refugees. The UN agencies that are working there, like UNHCR, the World Migration Program, they're facing major funding shortfalls. And I think what's really required, and it's something we talk about in a report we released over the weekend on the 7 things that need to be done, is that we do need the Secretary General of the United Nations, under his auspices, to hold a major conference of donor countries, countries that are willing to step up to the plate, to provide humanitarian assistance, both for Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan itself, but also neighboring countries that are having to house Afghans who've been forcibly displaced by the events in their country, and at the same time to start coordinating resettlement programs for the Afghans who have been forcibly displaced, because there's little prospect that they're going to be able to go home anytime soon, and so they have to. Other countries are going to have to open their arms to resettle them. A number of countries, Canada, for example, has indicated that it's prepared to accept up to 20,000 Afghan refugees. The United States has said it will accept slightly more than that number, but not by much. The British have said they will take 20,000. But those aren't large numbers, and I think it's fair to say that it's probably important not to set hard and fast quotas, to take a flexible approach for those countries who've said that they're going to accept Afghans who've been forcibly displaced, but for other countries as well to engage in the resettlement efforts of all of these people who have left the country.
The Council has made a call to global leadership, especially on the principles of a responsibility to protect. As you look at this situation and then you compare it to what has recently taken place in Burma with the coup there, and taking over the military, taking over the civilian government, and global leadership has not really stepped up. Has been no global embargo on arms, and we see a lot of statements, but what has really been done to protect the people of Burma? Do you think that this it will be different for Afghanistan?
Well, I think this crisis was brought on by the Americans deciding to leave the country, and doing so in a rather, shall we say, rapid fashion that has helped create the security vacuum that was filled by the Taliban. But what I think is required is to certainly when it comes to human rights in the country, the rights of women, for the international community to put the Taliban on notice that they're not going to be recognized as the legitimate government of Afghanistan unless they adhere to some of the public commitments they've made, that they will respect the rights of women. There won't be retribution for those who worked for the previous government or for allied forces. Now, we know for a fact that that's not the case. There are major human rights violations that are occurring as we speak. But the new government, when it is formed, as it's formed, is going to want to be seen internationally as the legitimate government, and I think all countries have a responsibility to send a very strong message to the Taliban that they're not going to get that currency, shall we say, of international legitimacy unless they can prove it, that they're living up to their responsibilities not to violate the human rights of their own citizens. I think, secondly, as some of your listeners may well know, the International Monetary Fund suspended the special drawing rights of Afghanistan shortly after the Taliban seized control of Kabul. And I think there again, that's another key point of leverage. They won't get their drawing rights back. They won't be able to borrow from international lending institutions until they've shown that they're going to be a responsible government. So those are 2 points of leverage. At the same time, I think one certainly doesn't want to, as some have been arguing, former Prime Minister Tony Blair of Britain, has been saying, well, there should be sanctions, sort of blanket sanctions against the Taliban. Well, that's not going to hurt the Taliban nearly as much as it's going to hurt the people of Afghanistan. And so it is important, as one is, as the international community is negotiating with the Taliban, to say, let's keep humanitarian corridors open. It's going to be important to allow food assistance, other kinds of assistance to get into the country. Blanket sanctions won't do anybody any good. But as I said, there are some important, what we would call political points of leverage that I think can be used to good effect to bring pressure to bear on the Taliban. It's quite clear, though, that when it comes to the use of military force, that the international community is pulling out. It's not going to intervene in the affairs of Afghanistan. And so, one of the concerns I think we all have is, 2 or 3 weeks from now, when the United States has pulled out, that people are going to, the international spotlight is going to move somewhere else. And as many of us are arguing, it's going to be absolutely critical to keep the international spotlight on Afghanistan, to hold the Taliban to account, to use some of the points of leverage that I've mentioned.
Before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about this humanitarian land corridor. We understand that Many aid agencies are still there. They're still working on the ground. CARE, ICRC. So what would this humanitarian land corridor look like? Where would it be? And what do you envision that to look like?
So humanitarian corridor would likely take a number of different forms. One is when it comes to the delivery of medicine and other kinds of assistance that has to be delivered by air, that the Taliban would guarantee safe access for flights coming into the country, and that would extend obviously not just to the international airport in Kabul, but other major centers in the country where you do have airports. That planes would not be shot at. That those delivering assistance would be guaranteed safe passage in the delivery of whether it's medicine or food or other kinds of humanitarian assistance. When it comes to overland routes, again, there would be safe passage for some of the major road points of access to the country, whether it's the Khyber Pass to Pakistan or roads into Iran. That Afghans who are trying to leave the country are guaranteed safe passage, that they're allowed to do so. And by the same token, the overland delivery of various kinds of assistance would also be, in effect, the security of whether it's food convoys, you name it, again, would be guaranteed by the Taliban. And I think, importantly, as we're thinking about the sort of humanitarian challenges, that those international organizations and non-governmental organizations that continue to conduct operations in the country, and you mentioned some of them. Some of them are under, UN auspices, some aren't. That they're allowed to continue with their work, and that their employees are not going to be put at risk. So that's also part of the humanitarian corridor concept.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hampson, for your time and for your analysis.
It's my great pleasure to be with you. I enjoyed chatting with you.
Before our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
In one of our previous analysis segments, we spoke about the issue of homelessness in the United States. Here are a few excerpts from that segment. Let's watch.
Thank you, Hena. Well, the pandemic is still there, or as it is being called, pandemic of the unvaccinated. Homeless are being mistreated already. New York wants them to out of the hotels and on the streets, essentially, if not the shelters. And Los Angeles is closing down the encampment of the homeless people. Many of them have a full-time job, but except that cannot afford the rent. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Eric Tars is the legal director of National Homelessness Law Center. How many homeless people are there in America?
It's a great question, and it's very hard to give an answer to. The federal government counts on one night every year and usually counts somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 individuals. However, that's a dramatic undercount, and we know this because that's by using the definition from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. However, the Education Department uses a more inclusive definition, and they count over the course of a year at least 1.5 million school children, and those are just school-age children who experience homelessness. And so we think the number is probably closer to 2 to 3 million people all across the country over the course of a year.
You know, so many things are tied to having a home, the address and where you can say that, hey, send me things on this address. So New York Times yesterday has an extensive report, somewhat good report, saying that the poverty in our country is going to be cut almost by 50% thanks to all the stimulus checks and social service program because of the pandemic which were in place. Of course, those things are ending. But were those checks ever reached homeless people?
Many homeless individuals were able to access those benefits. We worked hard to make sure that you didn't need to have an address, that you could get the benefits through an organization, that you might have a mailbox there or, through other methods. But it was definitely a challenge for many homeless individuals who haven't filed their taxes in maybe multiple years, because that was the mechanism that the checks and the direct deposits were originally rolling out through. And it's hard for homeless individuals to have a bank account with no permanent address, often no ID, no way of verifying who they are. So there are definitely challenges for people experiencing homelessness, and those who are going to be evicted. The checks may go to their previous address, things like that. So yeah, we know that even those benefits, which have been a lifeline for a lot of people and have been lifting people out of poverty, and it's going to be a challenge to keep those benefits getting to the people who need them.
Tell us, what is this unhoused Bill of Rights?
So this is an effort. We've seen state level homeless bills of rights across the country for a number of years, dating back to 2012, 2013, were some of the first ones introduced. But this is the first time at the federal level that we're seeing an effort like this. And it's basically saying that our unhoused brothers and sisters, neighbors, community members are part of our community. They are deserving of the same rights that we all expect as human beings, our civil and human rights. And that includes things like the right to be able to sleep at night. You and I take it for granted. You and I take for granted we're sitting right now. In some communities, that can be labeled a crime if you do it in public and if you don't have an alternative place to do it. And things like voting, access to the ballot. And if you don't have a permanent address, in some communities, for example, Kansas just required a permanent address in order to be able to vote. But these are human rights. These are civil rights that everyone should be able to enjoy. And so this unhoused Bill of Rights lists those rights, not that homeless people get to enjoy specially, but just to make sure that they are equitably and equally enjoyed by people experiencing homelessness. And then going beyond that, talking about things that we don't often talk about as rights, things like the human right to adequate housing, and putting forth the levels of support so that every American can enjoy that right to adequate housing that we all should be entitled to as part of our basic human dignity. As you said, without housing, how can you, if you don't know where you're going to lay your head at night, how can you focus on school and your right to education? How can you learn about who you would want to vote for and participate in the political process? So that basic right to housing underlies so many other of our basic rights.
Tell me this. I mean, what is the total amount? We are the leading country in the world, largest economy, a capitalist country. I mean, it's shameful, even if the government figure 500,000 homeless or your figures of 2 million or so homeless, why we are unable to take care of it? What is wrong with us?
Well, I mean, the thing is that many people don't remember, we did take care of it. Homelessness has not always existed on this scale in this country. But in the early 1980s, President Reagan cut the top tax rates significantly and cut the HUD budget for affordable housing by more than half. And that has never been made up. So in the late 1970s, there was actually an oversupply of deeply affordable housing. And for people who couldn't even afford that, we had a safety net. We had adequate numbers of vouchers. We had public housing where the elderly, the folks who are disabled and can't work, or the folks who are working but just can't afford market rate housing, it was there. And we had a social contract with our fellow Americans dating back to the days of the Depression, where President Roosevelt said, every American deserves the right to a decent home. But that contract was broken in the 1980s and it has never been made up. And so for the past 40 years, we've really been losing deeply affordable housing year after year after year, tens, hundreds of thousands of units, to the point where we're now in this huge deficit and wages just have not kept up with the cost of housing. And we've lost our safety net. So, that's why we have the homeless situation that we have today.
Eric, is amazing. You're saying this is not a chronic problem which is unresolvable. This problem is more recent problem. And most significantly, you said that we had oversupply of housing at one time. What time was that?
This was up through the late 1970s. Like I said, there was a social safety net of both the vouchers and public housing. But in 1980, the budget for deeply affordable housing at the federal level was cut in half. And every year since then, for the past 40 years, it's remained at inadequate levels. So right now, we do distribute some subsidies to people experiencing homelessness who are housing unstable, but that only gets to 1 out of every 4 families who needs it. That means 3 out of 4 families who need it, they need it, but they don't get it, and that puts them at imminent risk of homelessness. But it used to be that it got to 4 out of 4 families, and if it still did today, then we wouldn't see homelessness on our streets.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. But while I let you go, tell me what's the difference between the homeless term and unhoused term?
It's different ways of saying it. There's it's referring to the same population, people who have lost their housing. I think for some people, homeless has become a pejorative term. And so people are seeking an alternative term that doesn't have the same negative connotations, that allows them to speak about the fact that while they may be without housing, that they still have a home, that, home is where the heart is, or they build their home even in encampments and community with one another. So they, want to shift some of that language, but at the end of the day, it's trying to talk about the same population, just lending them back the dignity that's been robbed from them in this process.
Well, thank you so much, Eric Thomas. Really appreciate your work. Back to you, Hena.
That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube and Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.